Okay, so we're recording. Hi, everybody, all my usuals. I'm delighted to say. Let me share my screen. You should be looking at my PowerPoint. Is that correct? Excellent. Good. Well, here we are in week 8. Boom. So we are a long way through. So what we're going to do today is the last chapter of your big textbook, and then we're going to move to my textbook. So you have a midterm next week, which we'll talk about at the end. And then when you come back after midterm, you're going to want this book with you, which is less bulky, so that's good. So today it says phonology and morphology, which is incorrect. It should say phonology and spelling at the top there. And your materials are the PowerPoint. You only have a reading post this week, no activity. So you can start going back and having a look through all your stuff for the midterm. And there's a PDF document that I'm about to talk about in the PowerPoint called Bringing Literacy to Life. And that's what you've got for today. Okay, spelling, phonology and spelling. It's interesting to me because often this is where people think we should start, because this is where a lot of students and teachers start in their own mind. But I hope you realize that now we have done everything prior to this. You can see that spelling is one aspect, but not everything. So that's why I agree with the authors and stick it at the end there. So I don't know if you've ever heard this. This is George Bernard Shaw. He was very annoyed about English spelling. He always thought it was ridiculous, and he always asked for reform. And he said, this is the only language where you could spell fish as gotti. So, and this would be the f, the GH as in enough for f. This would be the I for the O in women as in I, and then the sh as in the TI in nation. So if you put all those together, you get fish. And he said, this is ridiculous, which, you know, he has a point. So in fact, it's not super unsystematic. It's sort of like everything else we've done so far. It is systematic, but it's comprised of a lot of subsystems. So some things happen with some things, and they always happen that way. And then some things happen with other things, and they always happen that way. So what we're going to do today is go through the things that happen that are listed in your book. But remember, again, this is the usual caveat, and I'll say it at the end as well. This is not, the idea is not that you have your students memorize all the rules and sub-rules and, you know, the idea is that you slowly introduce these things as they become relevant, and you can use some of the activities in the book. So, okay, let's start by thinking about what your learner might come with. So now for this, I'm very specifically talking about adult learners, not children. So when we talk about illiteracy, for example, we're only talking about adult learners who are illiterate, not kids. So what are the ways in which your learner could be coming to this? So first of all, your learner may not use an alphabetic script, right? They may use a script. They're ideographic scripts that use ideographic icons. Hold on, someone wants in. Sarah. There you go, Sarah. So, but they're not very common anymore. They're like the really old iconic ideograms. You'd really have to have a learner whose first language was a native Indian language or something to have those. Logographic scripts, however, are much more common. Chinese, Korean, they represent a morpheme or a word, and then they also contain phonetic information in that as well. And I'm talking to the choir here because I'm looking at Anne, who speaks Chinese or Japanese. Anne, as your first language?
Well, not my first languages, but I do know Chinese and Korean, both.
Chinese and Korean. Okay, so would you say Chinese and Korean were equally problematic for you in terms of the scripts, or?
Oh, Korean is much more easy to learn than Chinese.
Oh, interesting.
Korean does actually have an alphabet that is correspondent to phonemes.
Ah, okay. So, so that was my mistake. I started with Chinese instead of Korean. Right. I never could quite learn those. Syllabaries are a sort of version of this, but where graphemes represent syllables and moras. So, mora is a kind of larger, it's a unit, and it's a larger unit. I'm not going to get into what it is, but it's a larger unit than a phoneme. And in Japanese, it's very important. And then something called abjads, which are scripts like Hebrew or Arabic that contain symbols for consonants but no vowels. Usually vowels are optional, you sort of can put them in. So Liliana, you're nodding your head. Is this what you learned when you went to Morocco and you learned Arabic?
Yeah, so we learned with the vowels, but then they showed us how it would look without the vowels and how to read them.
Yeah. And how was it for you going the other way along and writing?
It wasn't as bad because so each letter is also is very it corresponds to a phoneme. So it was kind of identifying what each letter, like some of them have 2 dots, half of 1. So it was okay, but yeah, I think it was easier because I always wrote with the vowels, but then to have them taken away, that would have been tricky.
Right. Okay, so that's the first kind of learner, the first thing that you're dealing with your learner. The second thing is that you might have a learner with an alphabetic script like Hungarian or Spanish or Italian. But it has a virtual one-to-one correspondence between the grapheme and the phoneme. So you can look at something, I love this about Hungarian, you look at something on the page, as soon as you know what each phoneme is, the grapheme has a one-to-one correspondence, so you can pronounce the whole thing. You've never heard it before. So you might have learners that have no experience deciphering spelling rules, in the sense of having something like read, R-E-A-D, and read, R-E-D, being pronounced the same. They would think this was insanity, and how is it even possible? So that's something that you want to work with. Your third option is that you have an adult learner who is illiterate in their first language. So they have no experience of any written script. Obviously, they will have a lot of experience with signposting, meaning, labels and things that are, but these will all be kind of chunks of things that are looked at as a whole. So they're looked at in terms of a pattern, that they recognize that means stop, or that means this, or this means that, but they won't have experience breaking down into different word parts. So those are your 3 possibilities. I'm going to start with the last one, because virtually all ESL, EFL materials, including your textbook, assume that your learner is literate. Now, it's also true that virtually all your learners that you'll end up working with will be literate, so that's not a problem. However, there's at least one person in this class, I think it's Rennie, who's working with someone who is illiterate. an illiterate adult. So should this happen to you, there are materials that address this and places that you can go look for materials and help. So what I did was bring one. Can you see that, or is it stopped sharing? Sharing is paused. Okay, hold on 1 second. Resume share. Okay, stop share. Sorry, I'm faffing around. Share screen. Okay, can you see bringing literacy to life? Is that what you're looking at? Okay, great. So this is just one material that's been produced by the Center for Applied Linguistics, so CAL, in Washington, D.C., and it's actually pretty old now. It was published in 2000, this version of it, but there's nothing inherently wrong with any of its ideas or anything that it's saying. And as I say, this is only one. I'm giving you this as an idea. This is not a set of activities. It's a set of things, issues, and concerns that you would have to think about should you come. So it's more of a background material for you. So hold on, I'm just going to skip a second. It was a research based. So here, for example, now I don't know how many of these are still going because this was published in 2000, but pretty much anywhere that you are, you'll find that there's some kind of partnership or community-based action group or something to help you with literacy. Then what this book is to look at give you some background in terms of, so it's 9 chapters. It starts with state of the art, discusses some special features, focus on reading and writing, emphasis of active learning. It then talks about meaning-based approaches to develop literacy. That would be as opposed to phonetic or phonetic alphabet approaches or syntactic word part approaches. Teaching adult literacy using computer and video, native language, using native language literacy, what they have of it, learner assessment, curriculum development, staff development, and curriculum models. So this is a sort of background piece of material. If someone suddenly says to you, you know, which they did to me actually in Atlanta, they said, we have this group of women who are from Somalia and they need a tutor, and the tutor has to go to their homes to tutor them with an interpreter, so it has to be a woman. And so I did it for a little while, and this was one of the things that I used just to get me thinking about what this was going to mean in terms of a completely different approach to the students that I had previously. So that I've just given you as a what do you call it, resource. Going back to the lecture. All right, back to share. Okay. All right. So there are also, oh, hold on. Are we sharing again the PowerPoint? Excellent. So there are also some websites, obviously, and you can Google those. There was a nice one I found here that has some ESL literacy readers. So basically, in this day and age, there's enough help for you out there in terms of you can educate yourself, on the kinds of issues and problems that you might have. My point really is to make sure that you do that, because it's a completely different experience than working with literate learners. And one thing that happened to me was I kept forgetting. So, you have a tendency to sort of start writing something or spelling something, God help me, or all kinds of things. So you have to really think about approaches. I had to plan. You'd think it was sort of funny because you think maybe you have to plan your lessons less, in a sense, because you're just talking, right? And there's a lot of repetition and imitation. But in fact, I had to plan my lessons more, because I had to make sure that I wasn't going to rely on any skill set that they just didn't have. So it was an interesting experience. All right, so assuming that we don't, so that's all we're going to talk about illiterate learners, but if anyone has any questions, let me know. Now we're moving back to learners that are literate. They may have an alphabetic script or a different kind of script, but essentially that's what we're looking at from here on in. So some of the terms that I use with spelling, particularly, open syllables and closed syllables we've looked at before with phonology, but what people also use is vowel graphemes and vowel diagraphs, which is something that we haven't looked at before specifically from this perspective. So a vowel grapheme, or a letter, is like a single vowel, right? A, e. A vowel digraph is when you have two letters, but it's one vowel. So like it could be a monophthong, like E, okay, so which could be EE or EA in spelling, or it could be a diphthong, like A, I, like day or die. All those are called vowel digraphs, okay? And of course, the reason that it's kind of a mess is because of the Great Vowel Shift, which I'm not going to get into. Your book chit-chats about a little bit, and if you're interested in it, we do have an etymology course, and Sal surely goes into all of it. But yeah, essentially, there was a shift, and we ended up with lots of mixed up symbols and mixed up sounds. All right, so I decided I wasn't going to recreate entireties of your book chapter for this because it seems silly. So all I'm going to do is point out. So you should have your book chapter available to you now so that you can follow along, right? So the first thing that your book does is talking about the alphabet. So this is there are 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, U idea, right? So it's on page 422. It's right at the beginning of your chapter, past the description part, and you should be looking at figure 12.1. So the idea is basically, if you say B, the letter B, you don't say B, right? I mean, we do when we're talking about phonology and phonemes, but when anybody's trying to spell aloud, they say B, right? So every time you say a consonant, you're actually creating a vowel at the same time, right? So you don't say, you could conceivably say ba, right? But we don't, we say B, right? So we say B, C, D, E, G, P, T, V. Okay, but if we're saying A, then we use the diphthong, right? We say A, right? Conceivably, again, we could say A or something else, but we don't. We say A, and we do the same with H, J. Okay, so can you see what's happening? Some consonants go with some vowels when you're spelling out loud, and some go with others. And to us, it seems, for a native speaker, it seems completely automatic. Like a B is a B and an E vowel, right? But the truth is, if you're a non-native speaker, there's no reason why it has to be B and not bar or boo or any of those things, right? So the first thing that you want to do is talk to your students. They get very confused because you'll say it's spelled B-E-E-T or whatever, and they're like, in fact, it's spelled B-E-E-T, right? So, but you always add the vowel in. So that's the first thing that you want to work with them on, so that they can spell out loud. And don't assume that it's automatic. It isn't automatic. Then they also talk here about, when you're talking about the alphabet, you could talk about digraphs, like the y, w, and the u sound. So you get qu, question, and kya, cute, right? So again, there's no reason that your students would understand that sound gets added in. And there are also some spelling to sound correspondences that are generally taught to L1 children as part of phonetics and can be helpful for L2. So these ones are the ones on page 425. So these are tables 12.2, for example, where you have the letter A that goes with a, cat, and the letter E that goes with met. Okay, some of those correspondences that you teach children and that you can teach here too. Then you want to split up the world into, as usual, into vowels and consonants, right? So there are some spelling rules with vowels and there are some spelling rules with consonants. So looking at vowels, the biggest difference is between what was traditionally called short and long vowels, or is now called, and your book prefers to call, lax and tense vowels, okay? So to be honest, I don't really care what you call them as long as you know what the difference is, you know, the difference between the pairs, you know, E and and all of the long versus lax versus tense. So there are at least 4 different things that happen that it matters whether it's a short vowel or a long vowel. So whether it's a lax vowel or a tense vowel, and your book addresses those on tables 2.3 and 2.4. So 12.3 rather, is the letters that are used in, so again, A, E, I, O, U, the vowel letters that we have, and how those vowel letters match with lax vowels and with tense vowels. So for example, if you have a long tense vowel like A for rate, then you'll use that A vowel, but under if there's no following long vowel, if it's a short vowel, then it'll come out rat, ah. So, but it's the same vowel letter. So it's giving you some rules like that, you know, I'm what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sort of ambivalent about some of these things. I think some of these things can really help. And some of these things are, if you just sort of throw them at the students randomly and say, here, try and learn all these rules, they probably don't help. What happens is the learners get a sense that everything's all over the place and it's a nightmare. So I would really pick and choose these things depending upon what your point is that you're looking at. So table 12.4 In this one, you've got that doubling of medial vowels, and actually we'll do that again when you've got lax vowels, but not with tense vowels. So when you've got short vowels versus long vowels. And then two more, closed syllables with tense vowels gives you the double vowel, and open syllables with tense vowels gives you those vowel digraphs, those or what you can think of as essentially the sound of a diphthong, so ending with a w or a y. So those are four basic rules that many teachers teach their adult ESL learners. They think that they're useful, and as I say, I think it can be useful. I think it's the kind of thing that you teach, you plaster on the wall, you know, a very easy to read kind of table that looks at the examples that you've looked at with your learners, and then you can point to it and say, remember that spelling, remember this spelling, you know. So if you use it that way, I think it is helpful. The other way it's really helpful is if your student says to you, why is that double? And you say, you know, why is the spelling double? And you say, that's an excellent point. I don't know the answer to that. So then you go to this book and you find out the answer, and then you understand why it's later versus latter and so on. So this is, you know, it's sort of doubly useful there. It's not that you should sort of lift it all off and regurgitate it to your students and hope they remember a million rules. So it's also true that there are exceptions. So it isn't a rule that they can apply every time. If you think for one of the example words your books gives you is look, which strictly speaking should be Luke. So it's important not to overwhelm your students, to use it as it comes up, you know, as you're working with them and as they come up with questions about, you know, when is it EA, when is it A on its own, you know, then those kinds of things can come up, and you can use some of these activities and some of these rules. Okay, so they're the four sort of critical ones, and then people also have some rules to do with stress. Spelling patterns of stress. So if you look at tables 2.7 through 2.10, you've got some nice rules on how you spell things based on where the stresses appear. Again, can be useful because it gives them some idea of what's going on, but not, you know, it's not the be all and end all. A simple piece of advice, which frankly I find astonishing that even some of our graduate students don't do, is using your spell check. You know, if there's a little red line under it, then something's probably wrong. It's not always wrong, but 99% of the time it is wrong. So I'm never really sure why I get things from students with red lines under. Like, so it's clear that it's a misspelling. It's still there when I get it. The only thing I can think of is that you've turned off, whoever the student is has turned off their spell check, so they don't see the little red line. But as soon as it comes to me, I see it. So it's a small thing, but it's critical, right? Your students should be using their spell check all the time. They should also be using their grammar check that gives you the little green line too. Now, again, then I understand they're not always correct, but most of the time they are correct. So it's important to get them used to doing that. So then if they're using their spell check and they come up with a little red line, and then they say to you, I don't understand why. I don't understand why that's spelt that way. Then you can start looking at some of these things and say, well, this is because of this rule and this is because of that rule. And, you know, if you really want to get into it, we'll do a lesson on it or whatever, but it should be contextualized in what you're addressing. When you deal with all these kinds of rules, they should be contextualized within the material that you're looking at, not just sort of thrown around, you know, let's have a lesson on all the ways that you can spell vowels. Any questions on vowels? I know we sort of sped through that, but anything that people have had, second language learners or themselves learning second language with vowels that have driven you crazy? No? Your learners are perfect with vowels and spelling.
Dr. Pickering, I have a quick question.
Yes, Eri.
I know the difference between L and R is, needless to say, obvious to native speakers. But what about O and O, like a boat, boat? Are they a very obvious different? I mean, are they very obvious to native speakers, or are there any vowels and it's a little confusing to even native speakers? I guess that's
okay. So you're doing the difference between O as in go and bot as in o. Yeah, B-O-T as in a computer bot. Yeah. Yeah, they're usually okay. The problem is the difference between o and or. Sorry, o and or hawk or. Yeah, that sound. That's often problematic for native speakers because a lot of native speakers don't have that sound. The tense and the lax O and or should be okay for native speakers. Yeah, I don't know. Is there any native speakers that have a Ari's asking an excellent question. I don't it's not anything I've noticed particularly, Ari. But I also have noticed that native speakers struggle with this whole thing in general, to be honest. And I don't know whether we've got anyone who's willing to out themselves, but you know, this is part of the problem with phonology and spelling, that there are a lot of native speakers who just sort of, you know, throw up their hands. Particularly, you know, I'm talking about teachers here who have been so inculcated with the 5 vowels thing and the spelling thing that they struggle terribly with the idea that there's 14 or 15 vowels and there's only 5, you know, ways in which you can spell those vowel sounds. So I don't know if anyone's willing to out themselves that they struggled with that, at least at some point. I did. I will out myself quite happily that I did. As I said, I think I said anyway, the reason I ended up in phonology, I think, was because I found the whole thing like so confusing. The phonetic alphabet, the whole thing. I was just like, oh God. I was so out of my depth that, you know, I ended up doing it, focusing on it, as a lot of people do. You know, you end up focusing on the thing you can't do because you're like, I'm gonna do it. So native speaker teachers often have a really hard time with this, more so than non-native speaker teachers, in fact, in many ways, because non-native speaker teachers, once they've learned the rules, or once they learn that there is a rule and they can go find the rule, they just go find the rule. Whereas native speaker teachers have this hard sort of inculcation about that we do with our kids that has nothing to do with, you know, we might do phonics, but then that phonics is only connected in a very limited way to some of the vowels, for examples, when you get older and they start using the phonics to help you with some of the double vowels and so on. But it's really a mess, and they don't use it with the consonants that we're about to look at. And so it's kind of a mess. The whole thing is kind of a mess.
I was gonna say, I know when so I taught first grade also, and there was also the phonics, but yeah, I was surprised with the reading that, you know, that some of the lax vowels have to have like they can't be open, right? And they have
Right.
to be enclosed. And so
Yeah,
that,
you have to have a closed syllable. Yeah.
and I think I was feeling at some point I felt overwhelmed teaching all the rules, just exactly what you said not to do.
Yeah, right,
It's
right.
because then it's like, okay, there's this rule, but then here's an exception, here's another exception. Well, here's another rule, but then here's an exception, here's an exception, and here's another rule, but here's an
Yeah,
exception.
I know. No, and it's yeah, and it's sorry, you're gonna have to excuse me for a second. I have got an allergy problem, and I'm now crying. Basically, give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Oh. Yes, Liliana, that's exactly correct. That's exactly the problem that you get into. And actually, I would sort of be interested. How did your learners? I mean, were they like frustrated? Do you think?
The adult learners, yeah, I think it was, so it was before I had all this knowledge, and so I would just tell them that reading is different than speaking English, that it was different, but now that I understand it better, I could have guided them better. But I think they were just trying to apply it, but it was too many rules, and then sometimes they would come up with an example and it was an exception, and so we would have to do that, and then it was, yeah, a lot.
Can totally rely on learners to do that. So one of the things you learn very quickly, that you say, yep, it's like that, and then a learner says, but blah, 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 and you're like, that's true. Now what do I say? Yeah. So yeah. And one thing I used to say all the time when I was teaching TESOL 1, and I agree with myself still, is you're not supposed to be a human computer. You know, you're not. What happens is the more you teach these things, the more you get used to it. So the more when someone says X, you say, oh yeah, well that's because of Y, right? But that's not because you're supposed to be a human computer right from the get-go. That's just because after so many years doing it, you remember lots of things. You know, so lots of things tend to happen again and again and again, and you remember them. But the whole idea of having access to resources like this book and so on is that, you know, you say, oh, I'm not sure, you know, I'll go look, you know. So there are literally, if you add up morphology, phonology, syntax, semantic, there are literally thousands of language rules, and that's not your job, to be responsible for all those thousands and thousands of rules, to have them memorized. Your job is to say, okay, what are we doing? How best can I utilize my resources to do this? So good. All right, good. Okay. So now we're going to look at consonants. And consonants is interesting because consonants are often not discussed. Phonics will include some work on vowels, but often don't on consonants. They seem to assume that they're all pretty much, you know, easy. But if you go back, for example, and look at, you know, George Bernard Shaw's Gotti, you can see that you've got lots of problems with consonants as well as with vowels. So if we look at consonants, we've got some nice straightforward ones like d, g. Again, make sure that you talk about how you say these letters. So D with an E vowel versus dog, or with an O vowel. G is the same, sorry. D, G is the same. And then F is different, right? So some words are nicely straightforward. Some rules are pretty easy and pretty clear. So consonants are double. after lac, short vowels, which we looked at earlier, like puddle. And single after long vowels, like poodle. So again, one of the things that's critical here, if you remember 2 weeks ago when we were, or maybe last week when we were looking at that that analysis we did of the Spanish speaker from Mexico, all of this stuff relies on a sort of clear idea of the vowel chart. So if you've got a learner who is, you know, clearly struggling with the vowels overall, a lot of this is pretty pointless because they can't distinguish between a tense and a lax vowel, a short and a long vowel. So first of all, you want to start with a pedagogical vowel chart and go through and make sure that they've got a decent idea of how the vowel chart pulls together before you start talking about all this, because sort of not really, a lot of the rules are totally dependent on this short long issue. We also have consonant digraphs, I should say digraphs. So for example, the sh in show, that is always sh, and the f, that's pronounced, that's spelt with the ph. The also you have the f in enough, that's spelt with the gh. So you know you have several of those. Then there are a few sort of extra tricky ones, which again, I would say it's good to have this information. It's good for you to know. They're extra tricky, and it's good if a student says to you, what about X? But I wouldn't necessarily sort of spend quality class time just going through the rules one after the other. So they're presented very clearly to you. 12.11 has the pronunciation of the k, so C vowels, C consonants, k. And then you've got g, and what typically happens with Q, with a Q, and the X. So that's tables 12.11, 12.12. And then you've also, remember we looked at palatalization where you add the year. In spelling, it's called the invisible year. And you've got two tables on that on 12 and 13, where you have some invisible years and some not. So again, for your students, if they might ask you a question like, you know, why is it few and feud? So if you think of feud, F-E-U-D, it's fear, right? You've got that extra little palatalization. And if you have few, few, no, it's the same, isn't it? It's the same. Sorry, invisible, no, through, that's what I was going for, or crew or chew, then you don't have that extra palatalization. Sorry, I'm struggling a bit today. I think I should have taken an allergy pill. So, anywho, there are also some differences between American and English, so particularly in terms of palatalization. So in American, you say Duke, or you say, what's another one I just said the other day? It sounds weird to me. And then in British English, we say Duke instead with that invisible Y. And so some of your students might have learned it with that invisible Y in there. So, and then you've got also some interesting ones here. I was listening to a British thing the other day, and they said issue, and I was like, oh, that's totally weird. I forgot I used to say that, because we say in American English it's issue, issue. So, but they've got issue, virtue, yeah, issue, I guess, is the one that I think of most often. There's a cat. Okay. This is Lulu, my other cat. Yeah. She's a sweetheart. She's also very hungry. Silent consonant letters. There's a kind of digraph where one sound is silent, like knock or psychic, and then there are quite a few that involve L. And in fact, interestingly, I hear a lot in America salmon instead of salmon. Who says? Is anyone here say salmon? So S-A-L-M-O-N.
I do, Dr. Pickering.
Say that, Julia.
I say salmon.
Oh, so interesting. I've only heard it in this country. I've never heard it in any other country. But we don't say it in England. They don't say it in Australia. So it's interesting to me that it's ended up here. And it also, I could be wrong on this because I've only really been in the South, but it seems to me also a Southern thing too.
I did not know that the L was supposed to be pronounced silently. Is it just a preferential thing, or is it supposed to be silent?
No, I mean, it's a dialectal thing, I think, as much as anything else. It's not, it typically is silent, but I've heard people say calm. I've heard people say salmon. I've heard all kinds of things here. So
one that surprised me in the reading was almond. I always said almond. I don't know.
Almond, yes, right, almond. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, and Julia, I don't think there's a particular right or wrong to that. I wouldn't say that it's supposed to be, it just, I have only heard it here, but I've heard it a lot. So I don't think that, it's a problem, but your learners might say, oh, I'm supposed to pronounce that. And you can say, well, some people do, some people don't, so, I mean, it's going to come contextually anyway. So, but yeah, that's a sort of interesting one. Sorry, I thought someone was going to say something. No. Okay, and then 1219, you have a bunch of these digraphs that appear, malign, malignant, damn, crumb, all these spellings where there's like random letters floating around at the end of the word, like crumb, for example, where you have a B at the end of the word, and so your learners are like crumb, and you're like no, and yeah. So again, I don't see that it's worth sort of, it's worth looking at these things. If it comes up, it's worth looking at. If it comes up, then it's worth saying, okay, so we talked about such and such yesterday. Several of you pronounce this word as X. Actually, it's Y, and let's talk about that part of the system now, rather than suddenly say, let's look at all the rules to do with silent consonants, for the hell of it. Because we know that non-meaning based, non-contextually based kind of learning usually goes in one ear and out of the other. And what is more likely to contribute to a general confusion about the fact that all spelling and all phonetics in English is completely unsystematic. So probably not the best way to go about approaching it. And then your chapter ends with common spelling rules. Now, Judy Gilbert, so if you go to page 442 to 443, these are So again, we had those 4 rules. You remember that Wayne Dickerson says he always teaches his learners, which were these ones with the looking at vowels. So Wayne Dickerson is someone that's been an EFL specialist for the last 40 years. He's a nice guy. He's getting ready to retire. Judy Gilbert, same. She has been teaching for a gazillion years. She's just retired. And so, but these are rules that she, for the last 30, 40 years that she's been teaching, she has shared that she uses. So I think they're useful as long as you recognize that they're not, there's exceptions to all of them. They then give you some general tips. Teach 1 spelling pattern per week. Basically I agree with them in the sense of teach 1 at a time. Don't suddenly start saying, let's look at all the ways in which spelling and whatever is different. That's not a lesson. That's just more of a kind of, torture. But as I say, if something comes up and you're doing something, then yeah, sure, teach that spelling pattern, introduce it, provide the practice. If you've got adults, talk about it. Use meta language. Adults like meta language, meaning adults like it when you say it's a diphthong or it's a vowel or it's a consonant. If they're literate, it helps them sort of put things together. So introduce the pattern, provide the practice. This is something I have done. I've encouraged students to keep notes on, their own. Well, back in the day when you used to have a little notepad and a pen, you could put some of these little rules down. Avoid teaching lots of exceptions. You should always say there's always going to be exceptions, but avoid teaching lots of exceptions. If your students come up with some which they are astonishingly good at, actually, you've just given them a rule. They're astonishingly good at suddenly coming up with, an exception that you could never have thought of if you'd been thinking about it in a million years. So if that happens, that's fine, but don't sort of deliberately start teaching them if you're working on an individual pattern. And they suggest here test periodically. Again, assessment is a different issue as far as I'm concerned. So my thought is that, the more you practice it, the better you get. So the more you point it out to them, the better. Once you've worked on a pattern, if you see it again and you're looking at it again, you can point it out again and say, remember that pattern that we worked on that's up on the wall? Here it is again with this. And, so the more experience they have with it, the better they get, rather than necessarily memorizing things. All right, and that was pretty much all I had about that one. I will say that following this chapter, this is the end of the book, there are 27 appendices here on this book. As I say, this is a good thing, because pretty much anything that you could come up with in terms of trying to understand what's going on is going to be explained in one of those appendixes. So I know I've said this all along in the 7 weeks we've been using this book, but I really do. The reason I made you get such a huge thing was because I think, honestly, you'll be using it again and again in your classrooms, so or yourself, in order to remind yourself of some of these things. Like, you're not going to memorize, for example, all the rules about, if you think, something like all the rules to do with spelling patterns and stress, right? In those 4 tables, you don't need to memorize them, but if you realize that that's what your student is being confused about, you can go back and find them and work with them. So I would strongly suggest that you hold on to the book, and if you're not sure about something, check it out in the appendix. The only thing we haven't done, as I've mentioned before, is the super segmentals, and that's because we're taking a different model for that. So, however, once you've done the model that we're doing in here, if you go back and look at that, some of that will make sense too. All right, is there any questions or comments about spelling? Everyone okay? All right, then in that case, I am going to, you have reading post number 8, which is in the classroom 1 through 5. So that's designed, those exercises, FYI, I think you will get this, but just to make sure you do, are designed to make you look back through the book at the different problems. So don't sort of make it up. You know, the idea is that if the question is your student is doing, every time they spell X, they're spelling it like this, what do you think is happening and what should you do? The idea is to make you go back and look it up in the chapter. So to remind you of that information. So go ahead and do that when you respond to those questions. And then let's talk about the midterm. Okay, so your midterm exam will be available to you by next Monday, by midday. Okay, I'm planning to get it up there earlier in the morning than midday, but it will definitely be available by midday. There's no Zoom lecture next week. There is no lecture, so there's no uploaded lecture, no nothing. But of course, if you want to talk to me, I am happy to talk to anyone that has any questions, and we can do that by Zoom, by email, or on D2L, okay? If you want to talk to me by Zoom, and now is a good time for you, you're one of the 8 or 9 of you that show up regularly, I'm not gonna be doing anything else at this time. So we can certainly do it then. But as I say, we can do it by email or D2L. And then your next Zoom lecture will be the following Monday, October 26th. The midterm's pretty clearly specified. It specifies what I'm expecting from you, how many words in each question, etc., etc. So obviously it's a take-home exam. You can use your, so it's not about memorizing rules and so on. It's more about thinking through some of the things we've discussed. But as I said, if you have any questions, you can let me know. Done. Any, I'm still struggling here. Any issues? Everybody's like, okay.
During a question about midterm test.
Yes, Eric.
Does the test include something I have to listen and figure it out?
I have not. No, not for the midterm. I have done, you will have to do that for the final, but I have not included a, you're talking about like the thing we did with the Mexican speaker. Yeah. No, that's not on the midterm. There will be something similar to that for the final, but it won't be, it will include also, because basically by that point we'll have done super segmentals as well. So it will be a sort of full assessment. It will be having you look at a piece and then say some of the stuff about segmentals and some of the stuff about super segmentals too. So don't worry about that for the midterm. That I know that was tricky. Like I say, it's tricky for second language speakers. I know that, so I don't like to do that all the time. But yes, there will be one in the final. There will not be one in the midterm. Any other questions anyone can think of? Well, it has been a pleasure for this first 8 weeks. Needless to say, second 8 weeks are my favorite because it's my book and I wrote it. And so it's going to be great fun. Yeah. So, all right, let's, if you need me, I'll stay on. And if you don't, then I will see you by Zoom. If you don't have any questions by Zoom, I'll see you by Zoom in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Thank you.
Of course.
I have a question, Dr. Pickering.
Yes, Miss Julia.
So you said, so will be a take-home exam.
Yep.
That means that we are allowed in some things to use our book, correct?
Yep.
Like looking things up.
Yep.
Will it be a timed? Well, obviously not, because we get a week on it.
You get a week.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's all I had questions about was the midterm.
Oh,
I'll
and
be
you're
working.
right. Your room has completely changed color now. The sun's changed. That's
Yeah. Yeah, it's really odd on this wall. It's like tan, and it's like, I don't like it. It has like a tan accent wall.
Oh,
and it's
that's
like,
hilarious.
yeah, dark, and I don't like it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So yes, Julia. That's all good.
Okay, so I'll be working extended hours over the next 2 weeks. So the lecture for the 26th, I won't be seeing you, but I'll log on and watch it.
Oh,
So-
good. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Good luck
All right.
with those extended hours.
Okay, thanks. Okay, bye. Y'all have a good week.
Bye.
Bye.